And what they do for a living is invest in companies like yours and hope to gain a return. If you lose your career or the business fails, you're not empty because your identity hasn't been assassinated. Maybe your arm was cut off, but your entire identity is not gone.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode in Leadership Blueprint. Really excited today to be joined by Peter Schatzberg, a really interesting character, and I think you're going to really enjoy his journey. So as an individual that started off working for GE, focusing on Six Sigma, he then took this and applied it to supply chain innovation. And then I think where his story gets really interesting, he's then taken that into kitchens and reinventing and bringing tech and innovation to the food industry. And I think this gives some really exciting parts of his journey. And then he's gone on to look at this also from a venture capital, private equity funding, and he's done all of this across the US, Europe, and here in the Middle East as well. So I think this makes Peter a really interesting person to have on the show today, from a leadership perspective, from a challenges perspective, from all of that exciting journey that he's been on so far. So I think we're really lucky to have him on the show today. And Peter, thanks so much for joining us, and kind of an over to you for a little bit more of a quick intro, and then we'll jump into some of the questions. So thanks again, and over to you.
Sure. Thanks for having me today, Oliver. Quick background, I started my career in General Electric, as you mentioned, went through 2 of their executive development programs, which exposed me to a variety of functions across their portfolio of companies: manufacturing, consumer finance, commercial finance, even NBC Universal they owned back in the day. And as you mentioned, part of the GE DNA was always a focus on Six Sigma, which is for the most part the application of statistics and process reengineering applied towards any sort of business processes in an organization, and using statistics to kind of understand what the data and measurement systems are telling you about what's actually going on within an organization. Then attended business school while I was still at GE, got a dual executive MBA from London Business School and Columbia Business School in New York, and then transitioned into becoming an entrepreneur in New York City in the F&B space. I opened up an organic QSR with funding from former colleagues and managers of mine from GE, as well as several of my classmates from business school and some other friends and family members. I think I had a total of 25 or 30 investors, which is not advisable, but nevertheless got the job done. And while running that business in New York, I was introduced as an operator to the phenomenon of delivery, where I really think New York was the tipping point for delivery in food beginning to achieve some degree of scale and notoriety. And I was observing that as an operator very early on, and transitioned into opening up ghost or virtual or cloud kitchens. Back in 2012, I was building kitchens beginning in New York, then in Brooklyn, then expanding to Chicago. Eventually, Delivery Hero, based in Berlin, or Frankfurt. They're publicly listed in Frankfurt, but based in Berlin. They have a very dominant position in the Middle East, have for some time now, since they acquired Talabat, as well as Hunger Station, and met with them and agreed to a seed round of funding. And that eventually resulted in over $55 million of funding to scale a business that most people in the Middle East might know as Sweetheart Kitchen, although that was the parent entity. That parent entity had around 25 brands underneath it. And I guess we'll get into the details around Sweetheart Kitchen as we go back and forth through the Q&A. I also spent a year in India working for a family office, or for an Indian family, coincidentally, a business that was owned by one of my Columbia classmates as well. So, the always kind of drawing from your existing network that helps to pave the path forward, and always kind of making sure that you're not burning too many bridges, although I have done that along the way sometimes. But over to you. That's my quick intro.
No, absolutely fantastic. And I think it gives an additional great bit of insight here to the listeners. So, as you mentioned, kind of as a bit of a pioneer in the kind of virtual kitchen space, how did you come up with that idea in the first place? You know, what did it take to bring that idea to life? Because it was purely a concept. How do you go from that concept to a reality?
Well, I think it was a slow evolution at first. I was running a brick and mortar business that was struggling to survive,
Mm,
and at some point began to take delivery orders through the dominant aggregator in New York City at the time, and kind of had the epiphany that the majority of my retail customers were from 1 to 2 blocks away. But my delivery customers were being generated from 1 to 2 kilometers away. And, you just kind of think of the radius of a circle, and the radius of a 1 kilometer circle is substantially, or the area of a 1 kilometer circle, and the population in there is much larger than those within a 1 block or 200-meter radius.
mm,
And, the numbers just said to me, well, it probably makes sense to focus on an area that is, 99 times larger than the smaller area. And we began to adjust our online presence and our marketing and our processes and our cuisine to kind of address the requirements of a delivery customer, which is substantially different than a walk-in customer.
mm.
Delivery customers, at least in New York City, were oftentimes ordering in large groups. So you needed to be able to get a number of salads or sandwiches out almost immediately, instantaneously. And obviously you had to kind of keep in mind logistics. But once my mindset was around creating process-driven menus and cuisines, and building the internal operations to manage delivery, we were rewarded with just increasing volume. So I began to
Mm.
realize or postulate that delivery demand was nearly infinite. It was your processes and your ability to handle the demand that would really determine whether your demand would grow or shrink. And I began to pivot that into a new business that, instead of being distracted by retail, would solely focus on delivery. And therefore, we could be even more process driven and even more focused with no distraction of a retail customer, which would then allow us to expand and have multiple brands, which would allow us to invest even more in our online digital presence, and get to a point where we were many, many years ahead of any other operators in the US in terms of focusing on the importance of delivery, because that was our bread and butter and it was the only thing that we were doing. Whereas the majority of brick and mortar businesses were treating delivery as incremental revenue and incremental margin, and in many ways a distraction altogether. So they were probably never getting as much delivery business as they could if they put a little more emphasis towards it, because the market was, for the most part, infinite. There were just
Yeah.
not that many operators really putting any attention towards it. So it was kind of a slow evolution. And, the more you focus on growth, the more growth you achieve. And then you have your next problem which is operationally processing and handling, and bringing your technology up to speed, and eventually building supply chain technology in order to manage your inventory. And unfortunately, F&B has always lagged behind most other industries in terms of technology. So we had to build all of our technology proprietary from the ground up, and couldn't find anything off the shelf. So that was, our next sort of evolution was moving towards a problem most entrepreneurs, I guess, wish to have. How do we possibly handle the amount of volume we are receiving professionally and in a cost-efficient manner? We have too much volume right now. So, building the systems and processes and technology to be able to handle it.
It's interesting. And I think the point I probably never really thought of is, as you said early on in that, was having to change how you would literally deliver to that customer, because the delivery customer would have different expectations, order size, therefore your process would have to change for them. And I think that's a really interesting bit of insight there, because normally you would just say, as you were saying, other businesses were doing was they would just bolt on a couple of additional bits of delivery to top up their income. And so I think that's complete mind shift is quite interesting, and obviously really relevant for what we're discussing here on the podcast. So we sort of mentioned Sweetheart Kitchen earlier, and obviously they've been referred to in the past as very much sort of almost like a Six Sigma kitchen. And I think, that is obviously due to the processes and some of that mindset and innovation you brought to it. What in practice would that have meant? And I think it's interesting to kind of, let's put some of that into the real world situation of a great buzzword, but what did that mean in terms of making these guys stand out and really be a differentiator in the market?
I mean, I certainly was marketing Sweetheart Kitchen to investors as a Six Sigma kitchen, but to the consumer, I would never use that kind of lingo because it's not particularly sexy. However, when explaining what we were doing to investors, to me, Six Sigma is always about building measurement systems that allow you to capture data so that you understand, whether it's through barcodes or routing software, you understand and can control and measure the different stages of a particular process. It doesn't matter if it's food, furniture, but inventory flows. So the time raw materials are received to the processing of raw material into finished and semi-finished goods, or the time from when an orders from a consumer is received in the kitchen to the time it is finished and ready to go, and even to measuring logistics. So, the terminology Six Sigma is really just the application of measurement systems to a process, and using the data from your measurement system to observe what is really going on in a very holistic way within a system, within an inventory flow or a supply chain, or quite frankly, any process. So if you're measuring your customer acquisition channel and you want to measure where and when along the process customers are falling off, you could call it Six Sigma, but it's a measurement system, and you are measuring the successes and the failures of the process as it flows through from beginning to end, and then using that data to adjust and refine your process, or potentially kick the process to the curb and define an entirely new process.
I think that's really important, and I think a takeaway that you'd see more and more successful business have is not just basing a decision on a gut decision. Having that data, making those small adjustments, sometimes over time that will lead to a big adjustment, and I think those are the incremental, really important changes. So obviously you've done America, Europe, Middle East. What have you seen as some of the differences or challenges in operating businesses within those different locations? Has there been any sort of key standout differences, or is it more just the individual cultures that maybe the end consumer, you do things a little differently? In terms of a business, how has that landscape been a bit different to approach from the different geographies?
Sure. I mean, I think my commentary is applicable not necessarily only to delivery, but to any labor intensive sort of sector. The US and Europe both have regulatory requirements that have been evolving over the last several years, where minimum wage has been increasing significantly, which is the majority of your labor pool in delivery logistics, as well as within the kitchen environment. Whereas the consumer is not necessarily willing to absorb the costs of labor increasing 2 or 3x over a decade. So that's been a real challenge in Europe and in the US. In the Middle East, labor is significantly less expensive, with the benefit of basket size being almost the same as the United States. However, you have different issues, such as a variety of different languages. You have people who, English is their second or third language, and people are oftentimes coming from perhaps from areas of the Philippines or India where perhaps they did not receive the kind of education that's required for the level of sophistication that F&B businesses have evolved to be. That certainly in the modern era where the level of technology in the kitchen has increased so much. So, I think each region has a different type of challenge when it comes to labor. And I think most operators would always choose, especially as technology is advancing, will always choose the low labor regions. So
Mm.
really, the Middle East is quite ideal because you have the consumer spending with a reasonably high basket size comparable to the West, and you have very reasonable labor rates
Yeah.
and not much regulation around labor, and you aren't seeing minimum wages increasing nearly as quickly as you're seeing in the US or Europe.
Yeah. And that's interesting. And from a leadership standpoint, then you've obviously operated not just in those locations, but you've also operated from corporate to startups, and as you mentioned, even in India, within family offices. How, from a leadership standpoint, has those different environments, regardless of geography, kind of changed? And or maybe what are some of the lessons that you've been able to take away from each of them? Maybe that's a better way to word it.
Sure. Well, when you're in a startup environment as the founder, the buck stops with you, and you're driving all decisions, and you can be inclusive, and certainly you want your direct reports and the rest of the team to feel like they're participating and they're being listened to, and decisions are not being made by an autocrat. But in the end, the decision is yours, and people kind of expect you to make that decision. You are supposed to be more informed than everybody else. And generally speaking, as a founder, you are more informed because you have a broader view of things. You have an understanding of the shareholders agreement as well as the market and the consumer. So your leadership style will potentially resemble more of an autocracy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in a corporate environment, in all likelihood, even if you were the founder and CEO of your own organization, you are not the CEO of a Fortune 500 company necessarily. So, there's more politics. You're certainly going to practice far more inclusiveness, even if you're a leader. Somewhere, even if you're a leader of a P&L or of a division or of a region, in all likelihood, you are accountable to a board of directors or to one or several CEOs or functional leaders. So I think things move much more slowly because there's far more people that are going to be involved in decisions. But in a large corporate, the decisions that are being taken will have greater consequences and more materiality. So probably the fact that more people above and below need to be involved in the decision is a necessity. In a startup, if you make a bad decision and you do something to your website, and traffic drops, or your click-through rate drops precipitously, you just undo it the next day. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
Whereas in a large corporate, if you redesign something, it could have, substantial financial consequences, particularly if the company's publicly traded. So it almost, reflecting back on my experiences, it can be frustrating in corporate because things move a little more slowly, especially if you've in a previous format worked in a startup, or especially if you've been the founder of a startup. It could be frustrating, but if you think through why that might be the case, once you get a little bit of maturity and time under your belt, you kind of understand that there is a necessity in the slowness that one might experience in a family or in a large family conglomerate or in a corporate versus a startup. And I assure you, every startup that reaches a certain degree of scale and value will eventually start to slow down.
Absolutely. And there's a really interesting gentleman, Daniel Prezio. I've sat in a few of his masterminds, and he talks about how businesses are growing. It's sort of from the 2 to 4 to 16 to 32. There's incremental jumps where kind of being in that limbo stage for smaller business, you actually don't want to be in the limbo stage. You want to really push to that next big jump level, because you need the extra layers of structure. You need the extra processes that come with that. So I think, you know, there is, like you said, there's a lot to be said about sometimes the larger the organization, the slower things work, but there are reasons for that. And I think it's quite interesting, someone that's had, like you said, that has worked across those, just to get a bit of an insight on that. So within the SaaS inventory space, you've obviously got good experience within that, and I think that's continuing to make quite a bit of pace change, especially with AI and automation. And I was keen to get a sense, where do you see the next innovation and trend within that space coming? Because I think that there's a lot of exciting things coming, and I'm just sort of intrigued, what would be your kind of insight as to where you can see the future for that space?
I mean, I think back of house, the replacement of fairly redundant, repetitive back of house processes, account reconciliation, controllership, accounting, and finance activities. You know, that is probably the sweet spot for automation and for AI agents, not only in F&B. F&B is always a late adopter for a variety of reasons, but I'm sure we're seeing that behind the scenes at certainly the larger tech organizations where you're seeing large layoffs. You know, I'm sure that's not happening in the bleeding edge innovation departments of those organizations. It's happening where they're processing payroll and invoices and accounts receivable and collections. And I think that, you know, there's several percentage points worth of EBITDA in a lot of organizations. And I think that's really where AI will find its place and some traction over the next couple of years at significant scale. And then we'll start to see it make management level decisions. But no one's going to trust an AI to replace strategic decisions being made by senior level management in any large organizations, especially those organizations that are performing fairly well, anytime soon. And I would think that these AI agents almost have to be operating, not just performing well and demonstrating that they're making decisions as well or better than their human predecessors, but they will need to be touching the data broadly within an organization for some period of time before they could be trusted to make strategic decisions. Because if you're making strategic decisions, you must have a really great in-depth understanding of the organization and the data and the financials, as well as what's going on externally in the market. And right now, I don't think within any particular sector, enough data is available at a macro level for AI to sort of replace a 30-year seasoned CEO. You know, when they talk about, you mentioned making gut decisions, but ultimately gut decisions are that instinctive feeling that someone who has domain expertise, they feel, right, but they've just basically analyzed something very instinctively, and their instinct from 30 years of experience has told them yes or no, but they're not shooting from the hip. It's just their emotional response to an almost infinite amount of data that they're able to process instantaneously. So I think we're a few years away from that, but definitely I see no reason why AI agents won't be replacing across the globe in every sector the most basic sort of back of house functions, which are very consistent across region, very consistent across sector. You know, you really don't see a hell of a lot of variation in accounts receivable from sector to sector or from region to region, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is definitely where, who knows what 5, 10 years down the road will bring, but I think for now that is definitely where people can see this working very well. And I think it is taking that AI innovation, and then the most important thing that I think we're seeing is answering a question that is actually a problem. I think a lot of startups that are failing that we see are the ones that think they're asking a question, but nobody cares what the answer is. And I think it's finding the answer to a question that the consumer really wants to fix, to solve, to improve, and therefore they will pay for that. Therefore, it will add value, and therefore, all of the good things come off
Well,
the back of that.
that's the problem between being an entrepreneur, looking at the market and saying, I see and can measure a problem and can present the total addressable market as it stands today to an institutional investor and say, I want to raise money to solve this problem. This is the size of the market, versus a potentially a visionary saying, no one can see what I am seeing. I have to come up with a way to articulate and convince, but the consumer doesn't know, whether it's a business enterprise consumer or just a consumer like you and I, they don't even know what it is that I am inventing, because I am a pioneer. I remember raising money for virtual kitchens and speaking to 60 or 70-year-old men, and they didn't understand how a brand could exist without brick and mortar. I mean, today that's everybody understands, but this is 12 years ago, and they were in awe that you could order from a menu that was on an iPhone. And very quickly I realized this is not my target audience for raising capital. But anyway, I digress.
No, that kind of insight I think is really interesting, and it is getting the timing right. It is getting the audience right from an investor perspective, the audience right from the consumer, and it is that sweet spot. I think we time and time again you do see a business idea that maybe doesn't go full circle because it doesn't achieve everything it could, because maybe the consumer isn't ready for it at the time, but it maybe originally was going to be something, it pivots, and that's what works at the time. So I think there's a lot to be said about that. And so I think it's a really good insight. So I think this probably takes us quite nicely into a mindset in terms of opportunity, in terms of grabbing that opportunity, and it takes us into setbacks. And obviously throughout your career, you've had some great successes and you've had some challenges and some setbacks. And one of those was one of your businesses in the that you're involved with in the US that filed for Chapter 11, but then came back a roaring success. And I think I'm intrigued to get a bit of an insight as to what were some of the lessons learned, what were some of the takeaways on resilience that enabled you to turn a failure. Well, a failure is maybe not the right word, but apologies, I can't think of a better one at the second. Turning a failure into success, or just taking that setback and having that resilience to drive it forward. I think some of those insights were always really good things to take away from this.
It's a really complicated question, because I've been through the cycle so many times. Back then I would just say, well, I didn't have a wife, I didn't have children or family, and I was just able to grind out the hours and be patient and put out fires and fight on everybody on my left and my right. And reflecting back now, I think that is part of the answer, is just putting in the work and trying new things and seeing what works. Part of it is if you have no other distractions or commitments in your life, you can kind of say to yourself, well, if this goes down, I'll go down with the ship. You can burn the boats, and you don't have to worry about the consequences, particularly in the United States, because it's not as dangerous to go through a bankruptcy in the US as it is elsewhere in the world. So, you can kind of have that burn the ships mentality when you're young without commitments. And oftentimes that is enough to get a small business from failure to success. The other critical thing for me was I didn't have intrusive or activist investors. Everybody allowed me to do my thing, and there were no politics. It was less about jockeying for power. There was no concern over minority provisions. There weren't the complexities that I've had to deal with in later stage projects. So an early stage turnaround, you don't need hundreds of millions of dollars. You don't need to put out the fire on on 10, 20, $50 million of negative EBITDA. It's a small business. You're able to turn something small around. I
Yeah.
think it's far more difficult to turn a failure into a success once something is of substantial scale and substantial complexity. The dollar values are larger, especially if you're burning cash and you need to get to profitability, and the complexities of your cap table, and the provisions, your minority provisions, or your rights as a founder. There's just so much more complexity to a larger organization that has gone through several rounds of funding. You're not even just necessarily trying to turn around a business that is not performing well financially or operationally. You might be going through a fight where the business is actually successful, but it's failing because the cap table is not structured properly, or you have an activist investor who is a bad actor. And those kinds of turnarounds are substantially more difficult and painful. So I do think the whole notion of the grind and putting in the effort and taking risks and actually succeeding in turning something around is an early stage mentality. And you can go into your animalistic mode and work 100 hours a week, and it works, and you can apply that when things are small and you have a small team and you have small cash burn, and you don't have the distraction of a variety of investors who have their own interests ahead of yours and ahead of the company's. Once you
Yeah.
get larger, it's far more strategic, and it's less about grinding out the hours, and it's more about building it properly to begin with, or figuring out, how to get the interest of the shareholders aligned with your own. And sometimes it's too late once it's too big. If they're not aligned, it becomes increasingly difficult to turn something substantial around.
Yeah. I mean that's a really good takeaway, and it kind of feeds into what I was going to ask you around. You've been involved in some really interesting merger and acquisition deals, and I think within the kind of food and tech space, what's some of the lessons you've learned, and what would be some of the advices you could maybe pass on to, potential entrepreneurs that are looking for maybe that first big investment or that next leap? What would be some of the bits of advice you could pass on to them from some of your experiences?
Well, if you're an entrepreneur and you're transitioning into institutional capital and away from friends and family. So presumably you have your pre-seed, now you're moving to seed or even to Series A. I think it's really quite critical to remain a majority shareholder for as long as possible. And if you move into a minority position, to make sure um, that your minority provisions, your reserve matters are really quite substantial to keep you in control. But even still, it could be difficult to protect yourself once you move into a minority and your investors have some degree of control over the organization, because they will put their best interests ahead of yours and ahead of the company, even though they're an investor in that company, particularly if they're a strategic investor. Maybe they want to
Yeah.
see your company fail because they have a vested interest in seeing some other company in the same sector succeed. And they're okay writing off the investment, right? That'll typically happen with a VC who may invest in 7 different startups in the same region, in the same sector. And their loyalties might lie with one of the organizations that's outperforming you, and therefore they like to see you struggle and suffer. So it's very, very important to stay in control. One of the best ways to do that is to have a very diversified cap table. So everyone's a minority investor. You have to be careful that your minority investors don't all collude against you at the same time. So, you're really, really, when you become an entrepreneur and you start to take capital from institutional investors, I think the most important thing to do is to understand they're all smarter than you, more experienced than you, and what they do for a living is invest in companies like yours and hope to gain a return. And that return might mean a return because you're enterprise, your business was a success, or it could be a return on someone else's business that they invested in, and your business fails to enhance the return of the other business. So I think the most important thing is to be quite humble about when you're an entrepreneur, you're a builder, but you don't have experience as an investor necessarily, and the VC will outmaneuver you potentially down the road. So, just be very, very careful and cautious and do your best to have a diversified cap table with lots of, minority investors, and stay in control for as long as you possibly can. And try to make sure that the interests of your investors are aligned with your own. And I've made the mistake of taking capital from those whose interests were not necessarily aligned with my own, but that was purely a function of my lack of experience and understanding of what it actually meant to take capital from a institutional investor.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, it's simplifying it, but it's a little bit like the house always wins. So have a little bit of the extra knowledge to make sure you get the odds stacked in your favor more.
You're typically always, as an entrepreneur, raising money simultaneously with building your business, and you're always desperate for capital most of the time. So you'll take capital from the devil himself, and therefore you have to at least accept the fact that in many ways that your success or failure is in the hands of the gods, and it is a lot of luck. And you can grind all you want, but timing, you can only control timing so much, and you can only control the macro economy, which has destroyed many businesses, including my own, particularly, how many businesses were destroyed because of COVID. These things you can't control, and you have to kind of accept that's going to happen, and there's only so much that you can really control or mitigate. So just build a really great business, and hopefully you got in bed with the right people, and the rest is up to fate.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be said about that. I think it is the kind of making your internal peace with, you need a good product, you need to think about it, you need to have data, but sometimes you do need a bit of luck. Doesn't matter how much you try. So yeah, I think timing says a lot about that. So in terms of I think what I'm intrigued around is, what's maybe the biggest surprise lesson you've learned along the way in terms of the experiences you've had? Because I think there's the obvious lessons that people learn, and they are still really important to address. But is there one that just you never saw coming, just a real surprise in a lesson that might be due to geography, that might be due to how something particularly operate, that might be due to a sector, whatever it might be? Just what was the biggest surprise sort of lesson that you've kind of learned in the journey so far?
I think as an American who comes from a blue collar background, and the American mantra is, you can, if you work very hard, success will come. If you work even harder, more success will come. The harder you work, the luckier you can be. And I really have found that working really, really hard is not nearly as important as continuity and orientation. Right. So if you're fortunate enough to figure out at an early age what you're good at, you kind of stick to that, and you should stay in the same geography until you've really achieved enough where whether it's in corporate or as an entrepreneur, you're ready to go to another region, because going to another region means building relationships from scratch, as if you're 21 years old and wet behind the ears just coming out of college. I always was raised with, if you work really hard and you have high integrity, you will have success. Neither of those are true. If you know the right people, if you get a little lucky, if you put in the work, but you don't have to necessarily kill yourself, and unfortunately in certain regions lack integrity, and oftentimes put your interest ahead of others, even if it means being dishonorable, that oftentimes leads in success, financial success. Okay.
Yeah.
So if financial success above integrity and honor matters to you, then you don't necessarily have to behave with integrity and honor to get to where you want to go. So I think growing up in traditional family in the US, when the US had different values than are perhaps there today, going out into the world, and really it was a real wake up call. And it would have been uh, it would have been better if perhaps my father had gone to Harvard, and his friends and college roommates were people who could give me advice, and I just didn't have that background, and so there was a steeper learning curve for me
Yeah.
than there will be for my son, right? My
Yeah.
son will have and he won't be successful because maybe he won't work really hard. I don't know, but
Yeah.
but I definitely think those were two things. And if you can position yourself at an early age to have a really great network, that
Mm.
your friends all come from influential families, successful families, the path will be a little more clear, and you will not think, oh, the path of greatest resistance is the path to take. It's the path of least resistance.
Yep. Absolutely. I'm a big believer in the path of least resistance, in kind of all walks of life. I think there's a lot to be said about that. As long as path of least resistance with some integrity and with some direction and things. But yeah, path of least resistance, there's a lot to be said about it. I normally kind of tie things up with a kind of a free takeaway messages, but I think the one we've just covered there almost covers off one of those. So it's normally a kind of a message to a younger self, and I think that's kind of been covered there. So if we then looked at what would be your message to others in maybe a similar space in their life or similar part in the industry at the moment, so maybe a kind of a message to peers for the journey that you've been on so far, and then a kind of where do you see the most excitement and innovation for the future. So we always kind of do it as a message to the past, where we are now, and a where we're looking in the future. So kind of you can shape those kind of a little bit how you want, but a kind of a message for now and a message for the future. I think those would be two great things to finish on today, because I've really enjoyed it. I think we've covered some really interesting points, but I think this would really tie it up nicely for everybody. So yeah,
So a
kind of a little
message
bit
to
of free for
myself,
all.
a
Yeah.
message to my younger self, and a message to my future self.
Let's go with that. I mean, yeah. I mean, you can take the previous one as the message to your younger self if you want, or change it a little bit, but or a different message to self. So it doesn't need to be what you've discussed today. Could be some new things you've taken in, or a bit of a
Yeah.
summary. So it's a little bit of freedom there for yourself to tie up today would be great.
Yeah. I mean, look, the journey of becoming an entrepreneur and building businesses in countries or regions where you're not familiar, it's really brutal, but it's a true test of you as your character, and you as a man or as a woman, and it's bearing yourself naked into the wilderness and seeing if you can survive with nothing more than you know Mother Nature around you. And the jury's out on whether I would tell my younger self to go through what I've gone through again, or just kind of stay with corporate. There are days where I really feel like I should have stayed with corporate, and there are days where I think that my path has been just kind of exactly what it should have been. I
Mm.
think my future self is more conservative than I've been in the past, and that's a function of having a family, and also your market value increases over time. So if you're in your 20s and you're working for corporate, you might as well leave corporate and go take a big swing, because no one's paying you much for your expertise as a 24-year-old anyway, right? You could be a high-flying software engineer. Google's not paying you that much in your 20s. You make your money in your 40s and your 50s when you're working in corporate. So, and most of my friends who've remained in corporate all these years are burned to death and hated by the time they're in their 40s. There is no recipe, just kind of don't make decisions too rashly. Don't make them decisions emotionally. But, definitely when you become an entrepreneur, you become, generally speaking, focused on only one path. And I think the longer you can remain on multiple paths simultaneously, the more likely you are to pick a successful path. That might mean having two ideas that you're developing while you're still in corporate and bouncing them off of friends for a year before you jump ship. You don't have to leave corporate just because you have a good idea and some funding. Maybe let it develop. See if you could, we're in a different age where a lot of ideas can be developed with very little cost, or can be tested through social media to see if there's a good product market fit. So things are different today than things were when I was younger. You can test things out for a lot less than you could back when brick and mortar really was how you started a business. So things have really changed. And to my future self, it's just have multiple legs in life. Don't only have a career, right? And I will never make the mistake again, like I did when I was younger, of only having one leg to stand on. And if that leg gets chopped out from underneath you, that's your only identity. Whereas, if you have a wife and you have children, or you have a husband and you have children, and you treasure your personal health and you have two hobbies, if you lose your career or the business fails, you're not empty because your identity hasn't been assassinated. Maybe your arm was cut off, but your entire identity is not gone. And I think, 25-year-old entrepreneurs have no identity other than their business. And when their business fails, they're lost.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point there. It is I think everything is that journey, and it's the journey of your life tapestry, the journey of your family, whether that's your immediate family or your parents, etc. I think, and your friends, and all of that needs to come together to form you, so that, you are the sum of all the parts. And I think it again goes into the, hang around those people. You're the sum of the 5 closest people that you're sort of networking with. So again, be around the people that invigorate you, that encourage you, that do all this good stuff for you. So I think there's a lot of good stuff said there. And I think in terms of, it's nice to see the journey as well from yourself, where you've gone from different locations to the before family to now having family and so on, and how that's changed as well. And I think ultimately, like you said, you can have good days and bad days, but there is so much that has been learned along the way. And again, ultimately it's not for everybody. And I mean, it is that each person takes their own path, and you still have friends that stay purely in corporate and they've had different outcomes, and some have probably been extremely successful, some are burnt out, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really good takeaway and a really good wrap up from today. I think it is, the biggest thing is listen to your own voice and listen to those around you to kind of keep the flexibility on the path. And I think that part where you said around the longer you have more than one opportunity, more than one, avenue that you're pursuing, I think is the better. And I think that's a nice sort of way to look at it all. Is, it's good to be a specialist, but so specialized that you can't look anywhere else is always can be a bit of a problem. So yeah, look, from my side, I think it's been really good to chat today. I've really enjoyed it. I think there's some great stuff there that we've discussed, some great stuff for the audience. And yeah, for everyone listening, hope you've enjoyed. Please do like, subscribe, and share, and we shall see you on the next episode. So thanks again for your time today, Peter, and yeah, speak to you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Oliver.